very pleased that this general comment's been published, because when we were negotiating the convention, there were three major votes on Article 24, and there were many attempts to subvert it, and I noticed that those attempts still came in the general comment, but the committee won out and it stuck to human rights principles, so that there to be applauded. Now our job is to implement it, but the comment will help us in the implementation. From my experience as a disabled person and a teacher, I could tell my life story, say three little glimpses. When I was 5, I was not allowed to go to the ordinary school because I was a fire risk. I had polio when I was a kid, but I could climb trees and ride a bike, but I wasn't allowed in the school. I had to be sent somewhere separate. When I wanted to go to school, secondary school, there was a lift, but I wasn't allowed to use the lift. Only the teachers used the lift, so there was no accommodation then. This was before we had any legislation. And when I became a teacher myself, I had to go through a demeaning medical to see whether I was fit to teach. I asked the doctor, what's the shape and strength of my legs got to do with teaching? I've got 2 degrees already. He couldn't comment, but it was the law. And that law is still there in Britain. There is still a medical fitness to teach. So there are discriminations still all around the world. To me, the barriers are the key thing, and the barriers should be addressed in advance. There's an anticipatory duty to address barriers. The reasonable adjustment duty, or a reasonable accommodation duty under the Convention, is an anticipatory duty. So all schools, all colleges, all education establishments need to be thinking about this before a student with disabilities arrives, not after. And it's something that should be built into the practice, design and organisation of all education. Of course, that isn't happening, and governments hide behind and whip up, quite often I've seen this happening, whip up opposition to inclusion by creating fear amongst parents. This is one of the major things that is used by governments to actually stop inclusion moving forward. And those who get paid a lot, and I'm afraid in Europe, those who head up special schools get paid more than other teachers. They don't want to lose that position, and so they create fear amongst parents, and we have campaigns for it. There's a lot of misinformation given, and very little examples of good practice ever shown to parents before they make the choice. For the government in Britain a few years ago, made a film of reasonable adjustments in 40 schools, which was then sent to every school in the country. And it was clear that all schools could make reasonable accommodations, but most were not bothering very well. 20% were doing very well, 40% not very well, and 20% didn't bother at all, although it was already the law. So having laws is not enough. You have to create a culture of change, and that's why we built an alliance of parents, teachers, disabled people, young disabled people, and other professionals like education psychologists to fight for inclusion. And I would say that's a model that needs to be used in every country to bring together all those forces who want to fight for inclusion to actually force governments to change, because they're not going to change. There are too many vested interests to keep things as they are. And one of the biggest places of vested interest are the universities, which are full of people who have learned how to do special educational needs. Now, when we drafted the convention, we didn't mention special educational needs. You can look at the general comment, there is no mention of special educational needs. But in the reports that come to the committee, over and over and over again, governments say the special education people are dealing with this. Special education does not understand inclusion in the main. We have to understand the paradigm shift is away from the medical model to a human rights model, and that means in education moving away from exclusion, segregation, integration to inclusion. Just placing children in a mainstream school, some will survive, as our colleague from Africa said, but many will have not survived through the process she went through. It isn't good enough to just leave children to survive. We have to address the barriers. We have to get much better at sharing how we address those barriers around the world. The last thing I wanted to say is about some work I've done on teachers around the world and preparing them. I find that the goals that we've put forward on the Sustainable Development Goals don't address teachers sufficiently. You can't have inclusion without teachers, and if you don't address teachers and their training and have mandatory training for teachers, we will still be here in 30 years' time talking about inclusion. The Education International, which represents 40 million teachers, is supporting inclusion. Many local branches don't because they feel under pressure. But it's about advocacy and moving. In my own union in England, the National Union of Teachers, it took me 8 years to win a position of inclusion. And in the previous 16 years since that, it's come under attack practically at every conference, but we have still maintained that position as the largest teaching union in Europe. So it can be done, but you have to have advocates who will fight for it. Teachers need training, all teachers need training in understanding inclusion in the widest aspects of it, but they also need a twin-track approach. They must have training on the reasonable accommodations and support that people with different impairments need. This is not for specialists, this should be for every teacher. Then we need local resource bases in every district throughout the world which will provide the extra specialist support and technology. People have talked about technology and said, well, we don't need technology. The technology we've got is very important. 80% of people in Africa now access a mobile phone. Through a mobile phone, we can actually teach the whole curriculum. And that's particularly important to deaf people and blind people. So we can actually get this across. These don't need to be run where there's electricity, they can be charged up at a central place. We need, where that isn't there, and I'll finish on this, when I was going around some schools in South Africa, I saw boys sitting in front of a class, and the class was about large numbers. What was the size of number to get to the sun, the moon, and so on? The class had to work out, was it larger or smaller? I saw this boy sitting in front, and I said to the teacher, why haven't you included him in the lesson? Well, he's got cerebral palsy, I don't know what to do. I have to say, this was a school when Norway had spent 3 years actually developing inclusive pedagogy, but that had lasted only as long as they were doing it. We have to build resilience so it lasts after these interventions. I said, well, all you have to do is draw a square on the paper, and he can point as it smaller, larger, and so on, and he can join in as well. Whether he can write or not is not the point. It's the concept in his brain that needs to be developed. And this lack of being able to look round out of the box is what the skill that we have to develop in all teachers. They have to become creative, not part of a machine that is linked, unfortunately, and this is the biggest threat to inclusive education now around the world, to big business moving into education and judging education by results on a normative basis. The PISA, which is being used, just for everybody's information, which is everybody's compared on, leaves out 4% of children, those who are disabled. So we're not even comparing like with like. So I'll leave it there. There's much more I could say. Thank you.